Today, we're less than 1 month away from the 10th anniversary of Fallout 3. You can prefer the classic titles, you can think that New Vegas is superior in every way, you can believe that Fallout 4 was the best game in the series to date. What you can't do is deny how important Fallout 3 is in Fallout's history. So today, we're going to examine the history of Fallout 3. You may be thinking that we start in late 2006, shortly after development of Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion finished. But to get the whole picture, we have to go back further than that. The original Fallout 3 was in a sort of development hell, having work on it stopped several times over the course of its development. Titus Software halted progress a few times so that Interplay could focus on console titles. During this time, Interplay lost the rights to the Baldur's Gate franchise, a well-known and successful RPG series set in the Forgotten Realms Dungeons & Dragons world. Because they lost the rights, the third game in the series, Baldur's Gate 3, The Black Hound, was cancelled. Interplay subsidiary Black Isle Studios had been working on the game since their work on Fallout 2 finished. They were now free to work on other franchises, Fallout in particular. At the same time, Interplay had their own internal team that was neither 14 Degrees East or Black Isle Studios begin production on another game, Fallout Brotherhood of Steel. Black Isle Studios had plans to include a dual combat system in the game that allowed for the player to choose real-time like Fallout Tactics or turn-based combat like Fallout 1 and 2. The final decision was made for them by Interplay, who wanted Van Buren to have real-time gameplay. It wasn't long before new problems started to arise. Despite working on the same series, the teams working on Brotherhood of Steel and Van Buren only had one meeting together. Much like Fallout 2, there was confusion surrounding the development on both games. Interplay then made another decision for them. Van Buren was going to have a cooperative multiplayer component. Many of the developers at Black Isle Studios weren't happy at this point, so one by one they began leaving, many of them being the most talented members of the studio. This left Van Buren with what was essentially a ragtag group of developers who continued work on the game only because they believed they could finish it and make it a good game. Van Buren begins with the player character in a prison cell. The player is given a choice. They can be in the cell because of some misunderstanding and be innocent, or choose to be a criminal and take some bonuses to traits that would increase a few of their skills. After making the choice, the player would wake up in the cell, but not the same cell they fell asleep in. Then, the floor violently shakes from an explosion, rendering the player unconscious. They awaken once more, this time with a door in their prison cell wide open, and a gaping hole in the wall, leading to an outside world. Upon leaving the prison, the player is attacked by some unknown enemy. Deciding that fleeing can sometimes be the better choice, the player runs off into the night to explore the new world and try to figure out why they were in the prison in the first place. Eventually, they discover that Presper, a mad scientist, planned to release the new plague, a disease that killed thousands before the Great War, into the wasteland to cleanse it. He was going to utilize a ballistic satellite to release the virus, waiting on the second Holocaust in Boulder Dome, a large dome-shaped structure capable of surviving a nuclear assault. The main questline would have seen the player attempting to stop Presper. Titus Software then stirred the pot one final time by deciding that Interplay needed to have a stronger console division. By this time, Van Buren was nearly complete, but the remaining staff of Black Isle Studios were split and sent to work on other Interplay titles that were in development for consoles. Those who weren't working on console titles were laid off, and Black Isle Studios closed its doors. The year is 2001. Brian Fargo, the founder of Interplay and one of the creators of the Fallout series, has left Interplay. Herb Cain, the founder of Titus Interactive, the company that acquired Interplay, then became the new CEO of Interplay in 2001. It was Cain's decision to postpone Fallout 3 and take Interplay into the console market with Fallout Brotherhood of Steel, despite the company never having much success in that market. Because of the mishandling of various projects, Interplay missed several key release windows, like Christmas 2002, and what games they did manage to release didn't sell well. The company was heading into the red. It was then, in late 2004, that Fallout Brotherhood of Steel 2 was cancelled. On January 9th, 2005, Titus Interactive filed for bankruptcy with 33 million euros in debt. Their licenses were then transferred to Interplay, who were then evicted from their office for not paying rent on the very same day. Most of the staff who had stuck around till that point left because they weren't getting paid. A few months earlier, in an attempt to release some financial stress, Interplay licensed Fallout to Bethesda Software so they could make Fallout 3. Bethesda Game Studios would begin work on Fallout 3 shortly after, albeit with a very limited team due to Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion being their main focus. Interplay was then served with an involuntary bankruptcy order on November 29, 2006, and, as a response to that, filed a form stating that they intended to receive funding from Europe to work on a Fallout MMO, with their intentions being to start production in January 2007. Bethesda bought the rights to Fallout in April 2007 for $5.25 million. Interplay was allowed to continue work on their Fallout MMO, as long as they met certain criteria, like getting enough money for the project by a specific date and launching the title within 48 months. Interplay would make several attempts to get Project V13, the name of their Fallout MMO, off the ground over the next few years. They even had 2 million shares of their stock bought by Interactive Game Group to help fund the game. Bethesda filed a copyright infringement lawsuit against Interplay in September 2009. The lawsuit came about because of a lack of clarity on Bethesda's part. Interplay was allowed to continue work on a Fallout MMO, but they were only allowed to use the name Fallout. They were not allowed, by law, to use any of the lore of the franchise. It could be Fallout Online, literally, in name only. They didn't know this, and began working on a game utilizing Fallout's world, much to the dismay of Bethesda, hence the lawsuit. Interplay ceased production of the game in May 2011, and by January 10, 2012, all rights to Fallout Online were restored to Bethesda, and that marked the end of Interplay's involvement with the Fallout franchise. I went a bit too far forward in time. I didn't want to keep jumping back and forth between Fallout Online, Interplay status, and Bethesda, so now we go back a bit to the summer of 2004. Bethesda, who had recently purchased the rights to Fallout, were quick to get to work with their newly acquired franchise. There had been talks within the studio of what they'd like to do besides Elder Scrolls. Releasing the same type of fantasy RPG every 4 years or so might get boring to fans. The answer was always the same: Fallout. Vlatko Antonov, the then president of Bethesda Software, announced on July 12, 2004, that Bethesda had gotten the rights to work on a new Fallout title, saying, quote, "We're extremely excited about this opportunity and what it means for both Bethesda and Fallout fans around the world. Fallout is one of the great RPG franchises. Millions of Fallout games have been sold worldwide, and fans have been eagerly awaiting the release of a Fallout 3 title," end quote. Of course, Bethesda was neck-deep in another RPG, Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, which work started on shortly after the release of Elder Scrolls Morrowind in 2002. Oblivion wouldn't release until March 2006, so Bethesda couldn't devote many resources to their Fallout title for the foreseeable future. They did have a few people working on the game, but it was mostly concept work. The thing about Fallout was how similar it was to Elder Scrolls. Both were big, open-ended RPGs with lots of lore and extensive backstories. Pete Hines, the vice president of Bethesda Software, thought that Fallout was a nice 180-degree turn from Elder Scrolls and anything else they had done. The developers approached Fallout 3 as if they had made Fallout 1 and 2 in order to be able to objectively look at the past games to see what worked and what didn't. They didn't want to tiptoe around various aspects of previous games. They couldn't create the game they wanted to create if they were constantly worrying about whether or not it was okay for them to do something. Bethesda knew that there were a few key things they couldn't change, like the special system and key parts of lore, but everything else was up for grabs. As development started, Todd Howard, executive producer and game director of Fallout 3, and crew weren't exactly sure what type of game they wanted Fallout 3 to be. There were merits to keeping an isometric view like the classic Fallouts, but they felt it was best to properly bring the series into the 21st century. Bethesda chose to use the Gamebryo engine from Oblivion as the engine for their game, mostly because of how comfortable they were with it, and it was good enough for their needs. Developing a brand new engine for Fallout 3 would have added months, if not years, to the development time. Changes were made to make the engine better suited for a primarily first-person RPG with heavy shooter elements, as well as general-purpose tweaks. The character faces were a big complaint in Oblivion, and they were completely redesigned for Fallout 3 to make them look much more natural. But Fallout was a shooter with melee elements, not a melee game with ranged combat like Oblivion. To that end, they spent months working on how to properly add guns to the game. The team would spend hours in meetings having discussions about how guns should feel, giving that information to programmers, and realizing within minutes of playing it that it was garbage. It took time, but they eventually got the shooter mechanics exactly as they wanted them, and Fallout 3 launched on October 28, 2008. Fallout had finally entered the third dimension. Bethesda had decided on America's capital, Washington, D.C., for the setting of Fallout 3. That was done for a few reasons. The biggest reason was just how identifiable the landmarks are. Fallout appeals to gamers worldwide, but because of the series' backstory, it hit home for Americans because they experience a game set in their country in a post-apocalyptic setting. And what better way to evoke that emotional response than to show historic landmarks being in ruin or with giant mutants encamped in one of the most well-known museums in the country. The other reason was its proximity to Bethesda game studios. They're only about 35 minutes away from Washington, D.C., so it was easy for them to head to the capital if they needed to get inspiration for art or major game set pieces. The thing about DC is, though, it's not the bright neon city like Reno from Fallout 2. It's bleak, dark, made up of almost washed out colors. It shows that people aren't necessarily taking the end of the world in stride. They're struggling to even survive. When Bethesda decided to use Oblivion's engine for Fallout 3, some changes had to be made from the series' core gameplay. Slow, methodical, turn-based gameplay simply wouldn't work in a first-person perspective. Fallout 3 became an action role-playing game instead of a turn-based role-playing game. That meant Fallout 3 would feature real-time combat. But Bethesda wanted to keep some aspects of the original game, so they created VATS, short for Vault-Tec Assisted Targeting System. This feature would pause gameplay and allow the player to target specific parts of an enemy, with the likelihood of a successful attack being based on proximity to the enemy as well as their skill with their weapon. Fallout and Fallout 2 also allowed players to target specific parts of an enemy during combat, which made VATS a nice homage to the gameplay style of past games. The skill system was also changed a bit. There were still skills that determined the player's proficiency in a given area, but perks and traits merged. Traits were chosen at the start of the game and would give an advantage in one area and a disadvantage in another. For example, the Finesse trait increases your critical hit damage by 10%, but decreases all other damage by 30%. Perks, on the other hand, are chosen every level, instead of every 3 levels like in the first 2 games, and are generally little stat bonuses to aspects of your character. The Strong Back perk increases your carry weight by 50, while the Impartial Mediation perk increases your skill if your karma is neutral. Karma returns and is more or less unchanged. Every action has an outcome, either good, bad, or neutral. Giving water to the man outside Megaton will be good, while blowing up the city would be bad. Some parts of the game are dependent on your karma level, like certain perks and companions, which are back again. Companion apparel and weaponry can be swapped out with most other options available to the player. Their standard weapons have infinite ammo and can't be shot out of their hands, while all other weapons need ammo and can be shot by enemies. Speaking of weapons and armor, Bethesda wanted Fallout 3 to have a bit more of a survivalist element to it, so weapons and armor need to be regularly maintained to keep them as effective as possible. The system isn't incredibly deep, you don't need to scour the wasteland for weapon parts, but it does add a lot to the game. The story of Fallout 3 is quite a bit different than the stories from the other Fallout games. Usually, you're on a quest to stop some group from destroying the wasteland, which they view as saving the wasteland. Fallout 3's story is a lot more personal. It takes place 200 years after the Great War in Vault 101. You are a vault dweller. You're told that you were born in the vault and you will die in the vault. Both of those are lies. Your father, James, voiced by Liam Neeson, escapes the vault, not for the first time mind you, and leaves a shitstorm in his wake, which wasn't exactly his intention. Your childhood friend, Amada, wakes you up amid the panic, and you set off to find your father. In most games, this might not be a very interesting story, but Fallout 3 succeeds in telling it because it takes you through your character's childhood. You experience the birth of your character through their eyes, and the first thing you see is your father. The game fast forwards a bit, and you're a year old, walking to your father. Then your father gives you a BB gun for your 10th birthday. He's there before you take the biggest test of your life. Instead of telling you to care about your father, Fallout 3 lets you form an attachment to your father on your own. This is an important point that we'll come back to later. You leave the vault alone, with no friends besides you, only the guns on your back. You're a lone wanderer. There is a main quest line to follow, but what you do after leaving the vault is up to you. The world is yours to explore. Should you continue to search for your father, you'll make your way to Megaton, where a bar owner will tell you that James headed to Galaxy News Radio. Once there, the charismatic host, 3Dog, says your father went to Rivet City. A former associate of your father, Dr. Madison Lee, explains the details of your father's work. A plan called Project Purity, which was intended to turn the irradiated water of the Potomac River into clean drinking water, but was stopped after Catherine, your mother, gave birth to you and died, causing James to leave the project. After leaving the vault in search of a Gek, your father tried to convince Dr. Lee to restart the project. She refused, and he headed to the Jefferson Memorial, where work had previously been done on Project Purity. He's gone before you arrive, so you track him to Vault 12, where he is trapped in pre-war scientist Dr. Stanislaus Braun's virtual reality in the form of a dog. You enter the virtual reality, deal with Dr. Braun, who had taken the form of a little girl for some reason, and rescue your father. On the way back to the Jefferson Memorial, it's ambushed by the Enclave, who you may remember from Fallout 2. The Enclave military leader, Colonel Augustus Autumn, attempts to take control of the giant water purifier in the memorial. Your father floods the control room to stop him, killing himself in the process. The Brotherhood's headquarters in the Capital Wasteland inform you that a Gek is located inside Vault 87. You eventually make your way to Vault 87 to find a Gek. After finding it, you're taken by the Enclave. John Henry Eden, the Enclave president, frees you from your cell. Colonel Autumn seizes control and orders you to be killed. Eden tells you of his plan to use the water purifier to release a modified strain of FEV that will kill all mutated life in the wasteland, allowing the Enclave to take control. You are given a choice: leave peacefully or convince Eden to blow up the entire base. Regardless of your choice, you return to the Citadel, where the Brotherhood is preparing to assault the memorial. The attack is spearheaded by their giant robot, Liberty Prime. Once inside the control room, you confront Colonel Autumn and kill him or persuade him to give up. The purifier is then ready to be activated, but must be done so manually. Your last choice is to send in Sarah Lyons, a higher-ranking member of the Brotherhood of Steel, or go in yourself. The Capital Wasteland now has a source of clean water, and the game ends. For the first time in the series, a Fallout game had paid, downloadable content available after the launch of the game. Over the 10 months following Fallout 3's release, Bethesda would release 5 add-ons for Fallout 3, each of which took the player to a new location outside of the Capital Wasteland, except for Brotherhood of Steel, and had new weapons, armor, and characters, as well as their own stories. Operation Anchorage sees the player enter a military simulation of the Battle for Anchorage, a battle that actually took place in the Fallout universe in 2066 between the United States and the People's Republic of China. The Pit revolves around a town in the remains of Pennsylvania where the player goes undercover as a slave to investigate rumors that a raider boss has a cure for a disease plaguing Pit residents. Broken Steel takes place after the events of Fallout 3 and has the player fighting alongside the Brotherhood of Steel and Liberty Prime to remove the Enclave remnants from the Capital Wasteland. It also raised the level cap from 20 to 30 and allowed the player to continue playing past the base game's ending. Point Lookout takes the player to a swamp that wasn't actually affected by the Great War and deals with a rivalry between a ghoul and a brain in a jar. The final DLC, Mothership Zeta, has the player attempting to free several abductees from an alien ship that has been monitoring Earth since at least the 1600s. Despite Bethesda's incredibly successful past with RPGs, there was still some question as to how successful their version of Fallout would be. After all, fans had been clamoring for a new Fallout game for some time. It had been over 4 years since the last Fallout game, and over 10 years since the last true Fallout game. If Bethesda failed, the future of Fallout would be in question. Luckily for us all, they created one of the best RPGs of all time. Fallout 3 was one of the best reviewed games of the year, receiving numerous 10 out of 10s, and dozens of scores above 9 out of 10. Pretty much every aspect of Fallout 3 was praised. The sound design was immersive. You could find yourself wandering through the capital wasteland, with nothing but the sound of the wind whistling through the trees. The game's large amount of immersive dialogue options that weren't just padding for the game's length, they helped build the world. Though a common criticism was the recycling of voice actors. Most people overlooked that, due to the amount of time and effort it would have taken Bethesda to get hundreds of voice actors. The music was also a high point. Popular 50s songs, such as the Ink Spot's I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire, Danny Kaye's Civilization, and Cole Porter's Anything Goes, filled the radio waves and took Fallout 3's atmosphere to the next level. However, many longtime Fallout fans were quite skeptical of Fallout 3 becoming a first-person game and ditching the old turn-based system in favor of real-time FPS action. They felt it was dumbing down the series to appeal to a wider audience. And once the game came out, their opinions didn't change. Some reviewers shared their thoughts, saying that Fallout 3's gunplay is not at the same level as a game like Halo or BioShock, both of which were over a year old by that point. It wasn't so much that it was bad or didn't work properly, as much as it was just kinda clunky. The VATS system did help to alleviate the stresses of a combat system that were far from perfect. Another common criticism was that the game was buggy, which wasn't anything new for a Fallout game, or a Bethesda game for that matter. Some bugs were just mildly inconvenient, like NPCs getting stuck on a wall or behind a tree due to pathfinding issues, or items occasionally floating into the air. But some bugs were worse and could cause you to get stuck in a wall or fall out of the map, making you reload an old save. Worse still were the crashes that would happen for no apparent reason. It's not like they happened every few minutes, but even a few times over the course of a playthrough is enough to be an annoyance. Those who had played Bethesda games before were likely ready for this, but Fallout fans weren't. Despite the issues, Fallout 3 was awarded many Best RPG of 2008 awards by companies like IGN and GameSpot. The game received universal acclaim, but for the first time in a series, it was a big commercial success as well. Previous Fallout titles struggled to break the 6-digit sale mark within the first few months on market. Fallout 3 blew those numbers out of the water, selling over 4 million copies by the end of October 2008 alone. Whether that was due to the ravenous fans that had been eagerly awaiting the next Fallout game, or because of Bethesda's proven track record, is tough to say, but Fallout 3 was a success, and the Fallout name finally had the recognition it deserved. And that is going to do it for this video about the history of Fallout 3. If you enjoyed the video or learned anything, leave a like. Leave a dislike if you didn't enjoy the video or didn't learn anything. Follow me on Twitter at Mitten Squad. My name is Paul of Mitten Squad. Have a wonderful day.